The homelessness crisis plagues almost every major city in America. Now the U.S. Supreme Court agrees to hear a case that could transform how cities combat the problem. Proponents want the Supreme Court to overturn a case that prohibits cities from arresting people for camping on public property. Joining me now is Timothy Sandefur, the Vice President for Legal Affairs and the Goldwater Institute, an organization that supports overturning Martin versus City of Boise. Timothy, explain how this ruling restricts cities from actually enforcing homeless encampments on public property.
Well, what happened was that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that it's cruel and unusual punishment to arrest somebody for sleeping in a public park or on a sidewalk or something like that, as long as there are not enough beds in city-run homeless shelters to accommodate the entire homeless population in that city. The theory is, well, if there aren't enough beds in city-run shelters, then people can't help it when they sleep in a public park. That's really nonsense. I mean, by that logic, then if I were to get drunk at a bar and drive home and run into somebody on the way home, it's not my fault because the government didn't hire me a taxi cab. Nevertheless, that ruling has tied the hands of city officials who are trying to deal with the homelessness problem, or it's given an excuse to city officials to just throw up their hands and refuse to deal with the problem at all. And so as a result, you've seen this explosion of homeless encampments in cities across the country, but especially within the Ninth Circuit states, California, Arizona, and so forth.
And Timothy, we have definitely seen it explode. I can remember when it was a problem that was unique to places like Berkeley, California, and other cities in the Bay Area. Lived there for years. It was part of the fabric of the community. Now, the court ruling for Martin versus City of Boise specifically mentions the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment rule. Are cities encroaching on homeless Americans' rights by arresting them because they're housing insecure?
No, I don't think that that violates the Eighth Amendment. There's been a long time discussion over how exactly the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause should apply in this context, because it refers to punishment. And Justice Thomas and a number of the other justices have pointed out that punishment is, when you're arrested, that's not a form of punishment at all. So really, it doesn't make sense to apply the Eighth Amendment there at all. It should only apply to things like being sentenced to prison and so forth. So I think we're going to see some discussion of that issue when this case goes up to the Supreme Court. But even if you accept the idea that the Eighth Amendment applies to arrests, it doesn't make sense to say that just because there aren't enough beds in a government-run shelter to accommodate the homelessness problem, therefore people can't help sleeping on the streets. In fact, people can help things like that. They can make decisions in their lives. And I think what the Ninth Circuit ruling in Martin and these other cases, I think what those cases represent is this notion that people can't make decisions in their lives, that they're helpless, and that unless government gives them things, that we can't expect anything of them.
And Timothy, just to be clear, because I hear you and I understand it's very clinical the way you're describing this, but there is not a lack of empathy. You can empathize with those who are housing insecure, yes?
Of course. I mean, I've had members of my family who have lived on the streets. It's a terrible situation. There are as many solutions to the homelessness problem as there are homeless people. And the problem with the Martin case and these Ninth Circuit rulings is that it makes it impossible for cities to address these things on a case-by-case basis. It draws this across-the-board rule that says it's just you can't ever arrest them if there aren't enough homeless beds in the homelessness shelters. By the way, the Ninth Circuit also said you do not count beds in church-run homelessness shelters when doing this mathematical formula. Even though church-run homelessness shelters are the primary source of care for the homeless, those don't count. As long as the city isn't giving a government housing to these people, it's cruel and unusual to arrest them. That doesn't make any sense at all.
And just to piggyback on that, that's because it's not using taxpayer dollars, and for some reason, those that actually work with the homeless population and the communities they serve, who would know them best, places like churches and nonprofit organizations, are not allowed to have those beds count. It seems as though, if I understand your brief directly, it seems as though as much as people want to help, the legal system is tying the hands of organizations that would like to help to solve this problem. But let's talk about your brief specifically. Your brief to the Supreme Court focuses on taxpayers in Phoenix, Arizona, where there was a homeless camp called The Zone. 1,000 people live there, yet the city has since cleaned up the area and housed more than 500 people. How will your briefing help the city keep homeless from gathering there again and making the Zone 2.0?
Well, what happened in Phoenix was like the epicenter, the worst situation that resulted from these Ninth Circuit rulings, where the zoning was, we're talking about a population of 1,000 homeless people living in tents on city-run streets, and the city itself was encouraging this and operating this as basically an open-air homelessness shelter. And they claimed, well, our hands were tied by the Ninth Circuit. It's not our fault. And that shows how these rulings really give an excuse to delinquent city officials who don't want to do their jobs. It gives them a justification for refusing to take action. Fortunately, business and property owners in the area sued the city for this, and they ended up winning in state court. But when this Ninth Circuit ruling, when it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, both the plaintiffs and the defendants in that case and the judge all asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up this Ninth Circuit ruling precisely because, as you said, it ties the hands of local officials. And again, we're talking about the federal government tying city hands. This is a city matter. This is a local matter. This isn't something where the U.S. Constitution, this federal document, comes in and dictates how things should operate. Always, the problems of homelessness and vagrancy have always been local matters that are best addressed by people in those communities.
Timothy Sandefur, once again reiterating that the homeless deserve to have safe, secure housing, but we cannot have legislation binding the hands of those who want to help.